Well, thank you everyone for being here for our second lecture in the philosophy speaker series, Dr. Vanessa Wills' talk. So Dr. Vanessa Wills is assistant professor of philosophy at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. In 2019 and 2020, she was also the German Academic Exchange Service, DAAD, visiting chair in ethics and practice at the Munich Center for Ethics at Ludwig Maximilians Universität. In spring 22, she will be visiting faculty fellow at the Drescher Center for the Humanities at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Her recent publications include What Could It Mean to Say Capitalism Causes Sexism and Racism? And He Ate Jim Crow, Race Thinking as False Consciousness. And The We in a State of Becoming, comments on Etienne Balibar. And she has recently completed her book manuscript, Marx's Ethical Vision. Yay. And will be using her fellowship at UMBC to conduct research for her second book, Lessons from Black Women Marxists on Race, Gender, and Class. Her areas of specialization are moral, social, and political philosophy, 19th century German philosophy, especially Karl Marx, and the philosophy of race. And Dr. Wills is on the editorial board of Spectre Journal, a biannual journal of Marxist theory, strategy, and analysis. And the title of today's talk is, as you see on the screen, Lessons from Black Women Marxists on Race, Gender, and Class. So we'll take a peek at her second book project. So please join us in welcoming Dr. Vanessa Wills, our speaker.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here. I'm really excited to share this project with all of you. As you know from the beautiful introduction that I was honored with, this is very much a sort of live and active research program that especially because I'm going to be fortunate to have some time to particularly dedicate to it in the spring, and I'm really excited about that. So I want to thank everyone who made it out today, especially for a virtual talk. I know we've done many of those, so thank you so much for being here, for bearing with me through some technical difficulties, which I believe are over. I was going to think positively there. And I know that there's members of the department, members of other departments at Denver, and I know there are members of UCW Colorado who are in the audience, and I want to thank you for being here and thank you for all that you do. And I'm really excited to be in conversation with you and everyone who's gathered. So yeah, so I'm going to sort of get right into it. So the talk is motivated by a few related events, right, and questions. So one of those sort of comes from years back, the kind of intellectual frustration that I felt in the aftermath of the 2016 presidential election. I didn't find it surprising, like most Black people I know, I didn't find it surprising at all that Trump won. But what I have to admit actually did take me by surprise, more than it probably should have, was the surprise of white liberals about Trump winning, right? And that is what I ended up finding quite alienating, quite upsetting, because it meant that they just weren't listening, and they hadn't been listening for like a long, long time, right? Because anyone who had been listening to Black people in the United States at any point since Black people arrived in the United States could not be surprised by any of the things that were revealed by the election of Trump, right? Or by the sort of support behind him. And so that sort of occasioned in me, this like existential crisis, right? Of, well, what am I doing? Does any of this matter, right? What about all the work that people before me have done, right? And so that kind of dovetailed with just a longer interest in thinking about Black women Marxists for reasons that are probably relatively obvious, right? That ever since I began to do this kind of work, I wanted to know more about the experiences of people who shared these particular identity markers with me and had done Marxist work, or were doing it, right, or are doing it. And in particular, so there's that sort of set of questions, and then there's another question that should exercise anyone who thinks that a Marxist perspective or that class struggle is helpful or even essential in undoing identity-based oppressions, right? And the question is, does class analysis even allow, right, for theorizing identity-based oppressions, right? So is it possible to say anything that reflects the historical truth and the political manifestations of identity-based oppressions, and better yet, the more difficult task, can class-based analysis be an aid in fighting struggles against identity-based oppression? Because if it can't, then that's a good reason, right, to sort of reconsider the project. So the talk is then motivated by a set of 3 questions. Well, it's not quite what I want, but it'll be okay. So the questions are class-based analyses doomed to failure in adequately theorizing race and gender-based oppression, right? So are we able to understand these 3 particular phenomena, right, using class-based analysis? And I argue that class-based analysis is not doomed in that way, right? So class-based analyses are not doomed to this kind of failure. Now, my aim is, I'm not necessarily, by the end of this talk, going to leave you with a knockdown argument for the claim that they are not doomed in this way. I do have one, and I can say something about it in Q&A if people are interested. One place where I say more about that is in a paper, what could it mean to say that capitalism causes sexism and racism? But that's not the aim of this talk, right? Instead, the aim is to draw attention to the ways that Black women writing and organizing in the Marxist tradition have tackled and centered this question, and to draw some lessons, as I put it in the title, from the ways that they address this question, right? And to think about the kinds of philosophical interrogations that they're engaged in, thinking about the causal relationships among these phenomena, and raising questions about what might then upend these phenomena, right, given the causal relationships among them, right? And what kinds of things are ethically required of us, given certain facts that these authors take to be the case about the relationships among these phenomena. Right, so it's sort of a history of philosophy project, right? Engaging with authors who are not always read as philosophers. So my focus is on three women, right? One of these is unquestionably understood to be a philosopher. And in this talk, I'll be focusing on Angela Davis, Claudia Jones, and Louise Thompson. And each of these women were, or in the case of Davis, still are, deeply engaged in anti-racist and anti-sexist organizing. And they see these as commitments that are fully compatible with and mutually reinforcing of their adoption of a Marxist class-based approach to theorizing oppression. I may abandon my PowerPoint because it's being a little finicky. So Angela Davis is, of course, the best known of these three by far. Jones and Thompson's legacies have been less studied and discussed. As a philosopher investigating the relationships among identity-based oppressions and between identity-based oppressions and class-based exploitation, I benefit greatly from the work of historians like Carol Boyce Davies, whose book Left of Karl Marx has done so much to reveal the life and ideas of Claudia Jones, of Eric S. McDuffie, whose History of Black Women Radicals in his book Sojourning for Freedom presents the stories of women like Shirley Graham Du Bois and Williana Burroughs and countless others, and of Keith Gilliard, whose book on Louise Thompson Patterson, in a similar vein, right, really has helped to open up the potential to think about her ideas. And one thing that's sort of interesting is that just in the last decade or so, there's been this kind of boom of study into the lives of Black women Marxists. So that historical research allows us much greater insight into how these radical Black women theorize their struggles against multiple oppression and exploitation, providing us as philosophers the opportunity to bring them into conversation with ongoing debates regarding the causal, ontological, interpretive, and ethical interconnections that bind together our experience and understandings of how racism, sexism, and class exploitation function together. So one concern motivating work in intersectionality over the past few decades is the thought that we cannot adequately theorize the experience of being multiply oppressed. For example, being simultaneously subject to racism, sexism, and classism, or class exploitation, right? Not the same thing, about which I'll say more later. If we proceed from a theory that centers any one of them and regards it as in some way more basic, deep, or foundational than the others. For example, writing from an intersectional perspective in her paper Toward a Critical Race Theory of Education, Gloria Ladson-Billings writes the following. She says, Marxist and neo-Marxist formulations about class continue to merit consideration as theoretical models for understanding social inequity. We recognize the importance of both gender and class-based analyses, while at the same time pointing to their shortcomings vis-a-vis race. And she goes on to endorse the criticism that Marxist theory has oversimplified race. So in Ladson-Billings' view, Marxism might be useful as far as it goes as a theory of class, but gender and race are sufficiently distinct and independent from class that they require theories distinct and independent from Marxism to explain them. One of the insights of intersectionality is that race, gender, and class each function as vectors of oppression, and that it is a mistake to reduce any of these categories to one of the others. This insight is at times expressed as a rejection of Marxist approaches to understanding gender and race, which are said to engage in class reductionism. So what is class reductionism, right? What is that critique supposed to amount to? So I take it that class reductionism, right, when this is levied against a view as an accusation, the claim is that race, gender, and other social categories that are not principally defined by their role in economic production are somehow less real, less determining, less significant, and therefore less worthy of the attention of progressive activists for social justice. So a class reductionist approach might advocate that instead of aiming directly at anti-racist or anti-sexist measures, we should instead just work for socialism, right? And for ameliorations that affect people as workers, but not as people who are raced or gendered in specific ways, right? So I take it when various kinds of, whether it's Marxism or other kinds of socialist perspectives are attacked as being class reductionist, this is generally the sort of thing that people have in mind, right? This is the content of the complaint. So, okay, so we have this as a very familiar kind of complaint that is directed at Marxists and at other kinds of class analysis. And then we have this history of Black women Marxists, right? People who are embracing Marxist perspectives and are doing so oftentimes motivated precisely by a very real, sincere, and pressing concern with race and gender-based oppression. And historically, Black women Marxists, they're not alone, right? But they're, I think, of worthy of special attention, right, with respect to this question. Historically, Black women Marxists, thinkers such as Angela Davis, Claudia Jones, Shirley Graham Du Bois, Louise Thompson, Patterson, and others, have thought through the relationships among race, gender, and class in ways that put class at the center while avoiding the pitfall of reducing either race or gender to economic class. And one thing we often see is that in doing this, they are fighting a battle on two fronts, right? So they are often pushing back against bourgeois feminism, bourgeois anti-racism, right? And they're also pushing amongst comrades in their own socialist organizations against racist and sexist tendencies that exist there, right? So they're having to walk this line between two kinds of political perils, right? So this serves both as a corrective to comrades in their own organizations who sometimes sought to sideline the importance of Black struggles or of women's rights, as an example of how Marxist theory is not in fact class reductionist in the manner described above, and as an important intervention in debates around race and gender that overlooks the part of women with respect to anti-racist struggle, of Blacks with respect to anti-sexist struggle, and of working class demands with respect to both. The incapacity or unwillingness to foreground anti-racist and anti-sexist struggles is no doubt a fair criticism of some variants of Marxist theory, right? So it would be disingenuous not to recognize that. Some variants as it has been developed by contending political tendencies over the years. And this again is something that is going to be a sort of through line in the talk, right? That oftentimes when Marxism is discussed in academic settings or in various kinds of political settings, it is treated as though it is this like univocal, right, singular tradition, when it is extremely diverse and there are extremely robust debates happening within this tradition. Now, people who themselves are positioned within the tradition are aware of this, right? You don't sort of engage in socialist activism very long without noticing that there are lots and lots of different tendencies, right? But this is something that I think often goes missing, and especially in the sort of blanket, Marxist is class reductionist kind of attacks, right? So, so some variants did express, right, or have expressed more reductionist formulations, right? So it's so Eugene Debs, right, a leader in the Socialist Party at the early part of the 20th century, he simultaneously recognized that, in his words, quote, the whole world is under obligation to the Negro, and that, quote, the history of the Negro in the United States is a history of crime without a parallel. But he also stated that his party had, again, quote, nothing specific to offer the Negro, right? And that the class struggle is colorless. So we often saw these kinds of tensions, right, even among the better tendencies of the socialist movement. The suspicion that class-based analyses might be incompatible with appreciating the special significance of race and sex-based oppressions is not utterly without merit, right? But, and this is again key, what I have often found notable is that many characterizations of Marxists as just never being interested in centering those oppressions, these criticisms often proceed by perpetrating the very same erasure that they warn against. Namely, they overlook the life, work, and thought of any Marxists who are not white and male, right? And of course, if you do that, if you ignore, right, the incredible influence that Marxist ideas have had globally, and that people globally have had on the development of Marxism, then it's very easy to have this caricature of Marxists as just never thinking about race or gender. But it's very hard to maintain that characterization if you just look at anyone who's not a white man. And even lots of white male Marxists have done this work as well, right? So you actually have to have a very, you have to cherry pick, right? So yeah, so as I said in sort of, you know, in my initial framing remarks, the project is deeply personal in lots of ways. You know, and so, you know, I happen to think that Marxist theory is uniquely powerful as a comprehensive framework for understanding and transforming our social world. And that includes for fighting against identity-based oppressions. So if it's true that Marxist theory is doomed to failure as a theory of racism and sexism, and if it's true that Marxism is doomed to that failure precisely because it's a theory that centers class and that sees class relations as foundational in producing and reproducing identity-based oppressions, that would be an issue, right? That would be bad. I think it would be bad for the world, and it would definitely be bad for me generally, personally. I'd have to quit. But as I intend to demonstrate here, I think the lives and ideas and work of Black women Marxists suggest otherwise. So as I said, I'm choosing just three, right? For, you know, largely for purposes of time, but also because, you know, these are three, you know, very significant figures. I'm going to start with talking about Claudia Jones. So one interesting thing about Claudia Jones, so I think I mentioned briefly Carol Boyce Davies' book about Jones is called Left of Karl Marx, and that is because Jones is actually buried directly to the left of Karl Marx in London. So Claudia Jones was born in Trinidad in 1915. I'm going to give some biographical backstory about Jones and Patterson, but not very much about Davis, since she's much better known. Claudia Jones was born in Trinidad in 1915 and emigrated to the US, where she joined the Young Communist League USA in order to engage in activism in defense of the Scottsboro Boys, right? So this group of young Black boys, right? They're quite young, who had been framed in a sexual assault And this was something that that provoked a very large support campaign, right? Political support campaign that was that communist members of the Communist Party played a sort of leading role in organizing. And so Jones joined the communists specifically because at that point they were the ones that she was seeing who were the most organized and the most committed in defending, right, these people against racist persecution by the state. In the late 40s and the early 50s, she was arrested and imprisoned multiple times for her activism and her involvement with the Communist Party. She was eventually, because of her political activities, deported from the United States. Went to the UK where she continued her activism. Actually, one thing that's interesting is that the celebration of Carnival, like in the UK, actually owes a lot to Claudia Jones having been there and her organizing. And she died quite young. She died at the age of 49 of a massive heart attack, right, after these decades of persecution, of state persecution. So one of Jones's most important contributions to Marxist theory is the notion of superexploitation. And this concept is one that Jones developed to explain the ways that the oppression of working class Black women, as Black, and as workers makes them all the more ripe for economic exploitation, right? And so she developed this notion of the triple oppression, right, of Black women workers. This ends up, I mean, this concept, right, of super exploitation continues to be, you don't often see people using this exact term, but this notion that in order to understand the particular socioeconomic position of Black women workers, that you couldn't just think of them as workers, right? That you had to understand how their position as workers was then conditioned, right, by their gender and racial identity. You know, very important, right, contribution to Marxist theory, and one that we see echoes of, right, continuing today. You know, when we talk about the race, gender, class model, right, or even of intersectionality, right? I think we see echoes of the kind of thing that Jones was up to theoretically. She was very, you know, in this same vein, she was very clear about what she saw as the sort of special role of Black women workers in working class struggle in the United States. So in one of her writings, she says that the bourgeoisie is fearful of the militancy of the Negro woman, and for good reason. The capitalists know far better than many progressives seem to know that once Negro women undertake action, the militancy of the whole Negro people, and thus of the anti-imperialist coalition, is greatly enhanced, right? So this is one of the places where you see this kind of twin intervention that I mentioned earlier, right? Where on the one hand, she's making a claim about what is going to be necessary in order to secure the victory of the working class, right? And arguing that Black women's particular situation is not something that's inessential or something that can just be sort of left to the side to be resolved after the revolution comes, but actually that this kind of activism is itself an absolute precondition for any kind of successful class struggle in the United States, right? And then we also have this wonderful dig, right? It's like the capitalists know this, right? The point being, the capitalists know this. This is why, right? This is one of the reasons, part of the explanation, right, for their investment in racism, for their investment in women's oppression, right? And that this is a lesson that her comrades need to get into their heads, right? If they're going to raise a resistance struggle equal to the task of overcoming the attacks that are being waged on the working class by the bourgeoisie, right? Using these weapons of racism and sexism, right? So, here already, right, this kind of model of the relationship among these three categories that is not reductionist in any way, right? Absolutely resists the sort of reductionist framing that we can just sort of leave these struggles to the side, right? They're central. We see Jones also critiquing the racism of the feminist movement. So she writes, chauvinism on the part of progressive white women is often expressed in their failure to have close ties of friendship with Negro women and to realize that this fight for equality of Negro women is in their own self-interest, inasmuch as the super-exploitation and oppression of Negro women tends to depress the standards of all women. Persistent challenge to every chauvinist remark as concerns the Negro woman is vitally necessary if we are to break down the understandable distress on the part of Negro women who are repelled by the white chauvinism they often find expressed in progressive circles. So, in other words, there's nothing new about, the sort of complaint that drawing special attention to the struggles of women of color is somehow divisive, right, and bad for the feminist movement, right? We see Jones attacking this notion head on, right? And really, again, intervening in several different directions, right? Pointing out the racism of the feminist movement, pointing out the necessity of, however, a struggle against women's oppression in order to wage the kinds of class battles that she's engaged in, right? And that she sees as providing the sort of the context, right, within which these forms of oppression flourish. So we also get, even as we're seeing in Jones this sort of complex interrelation among these three categories, right? That's not reductive. She also makes some specific claims about the sort of relative causal role, right, of each of these. And I think there's different ways, we call it the ontological role. It doesn't, I'm happy to sort of, I think we can be sort of flexible, right? So she speaks to the case of Rosalee Ingram. So Ingram is a Black woman who was sentenced to death in Georgia in 1948. This is after she and her sons defended her against a white man who had physically attacked her after she resisted his sexual advances. And Jones points out that the indifference that white women had to the case underscores the racism inherent in justifying the widespread lynching of Black men as a necessary measure for preserving women's safety from sexual violence, right? So we see her tying we see her drawing a connection between the racism of white women and their weddedness, right, to this bankrupt attempt, right, pseudo attempt, right, to sort of secure women's safety. That attempt itself is totally steeped in racism and in a kind of gender-based hatred of Black men, right? And so it's completely undermining, right, self-undermining with respect to the project of preserving women's safety, which is something that Jones says is evidenced, right, by the complete indifference to the safety of this Black woman when she is actually attacked by a real white man, right, not the sort of specter of a a scary Black male attacker, right? And so this leads her to argue the following. She says, the Negro question in the United States is prior to and not equal to the women question. That only to the extent that we fight all chauvinist expressions and actions as regards the Negro people and fight for the full equality of the Negro people, can women as a whole advance their struggle for equal rights. For the progressive women's movement, the Negro woman, who combines in her status the worker, the Negro, and the woman, is the vital link to this heightened political consciousness, right? So, yeah, and the claim being that feminism cannot be successful unless it challenges its racism, right? So I want to move on to talk about Louise Thompson Patterson. And each of these figures, as I mentioned in the introduction, each of these figures is sort of navigating these contours of race, gender, and class, but they each have slightly different, or even sometimes very different perspectives, right? So my aim is not to sort of leave you with the Black woman Marxist take on race, gender, and class, right? But rather to see, sort of how much gets left on the table, philosophically speaking, that we could be working with, right, to help us to think about the history of how, very active sort of soldiers for justice, right, have worked through and navigated these questions practically, politically, and theoretically. So Louise Thompson Patterson, so she was born in Chicago in 1901. She moved to Harlem as a young woman, and where she encountered figures in the Harlem Renaissance. So these included people like Langston Hughes, the novelist Wallace Thurman. She was briefly married to Thurman. So many sort of fascinating things about Thompson. And one thing that's very interesting is that she was one of a number of Black creatives and intellectuals who were inspired by the example of communism in the Soviet Union, and particularly by the promise of racial equality, right? So there's this kind of separate question of whether the Soviet Union actually did do away with racism as they claimed to do, but they claimed to do it, right? They claimed to do it and they held it up as a worthy goal, right? Which is a lot more than you could say of the United States at the same time. And so this really sort of shed a light on it as a kind of beacon, right, for Black intellectuals at the time. Thompson Patterson was instrumental in helping to arrange for a group of 22 people to travel to the Soviet Union to create a film about racism in the United States, right? And that film was to be titled Black and White. The film doesn't exist, the project fell through, but the experience of traveling to the Soviet Union made an extremely lasting impact on Thompson, as it did on other Black intellectuals at the time. Asked by one skeptical reporter, first of all, this is the most racist question ever. So asked by one skeptical reporter whether anti-Black antagonism in the Soviet Union might increase if larger numbers of Black people lived there, right? So the more Black people you see, the more you can't stand them, apparently, right? Is the sort of premise of the question. Thompson's answer was the following. So she said, the real cause of oppression here in the United States is economic exploitation, not biological aversions, right? So again, like insisting that racism is a socially produced phenomenon, it's not natural, it's not necessary, it's not some kind of automatic impulse, right, based on our biological constitution or some sort of innate tendency to hate those who are visually different from us, right? This insistence that no, right, the causes of racism are social, are made by human beings, and is the result of economic exploitation. And again, like this is something that is an important and consistent message that we get from each of these figures and from other figures who fit into this category, right? The insistence that our social life as human beings is something that we make and that we could make differently, right? This is the sort of key lesson. I think it's the key lesson of Marxism. I think if you forget everything else about what Marxism is about, right, the point is that human beings are engaged in a constant process of self-making, and they can do that self-making consciously or unconsciously. And the sooner they figure out how to do it consciously, the sooner they are able to make themselves and to make their lives in ways that are conducive to their flourishing and that abolish, right, everything that impedes the development and freedom and self-agency of human beings, right? And so this is what we're seeing reflected, right, in Thompson Patterson's insistence that no, racism is not a biological, natural, essential feature of human life. It's something that we do, that we have produced, and that we could do away with, right? So in 1937, Thompson reported on a conference that the Communist Party held on the role of Black women in the party. And her report was called Negro Women in Our Party. So she tells us about what the conference was, you know, what happened there. She says the main emphasis in the conference was on the promotion of cadres, of leaders. It was proposed that special attention be given to Negro women on the basis of their special problems. And she gave the following analysis herself. So she says, there are far too few Negro women in positions of leadership. I think it will be necessary to take up as a special problem the ways to develop women cadres. I think that until we have a representative and large group of Negro women in the party, our work in the Negro territories is going to be seriously hampered. I think it is true, get the Negro women into the party, and not only will the men follow, but we will see that we will have a party among the Negro people that has its roots among them and is a very vital part of their lives, right? You know, and so again, right, you know, this sort, you know, very clear about the necessity of centering the problems of Black people, of centering the role of Black women specifically, right? Not seeing this as a kind of afterthought, right? Or something that sort of doesn't matter because we just care about people as workers, right? You know, very, very keen and, you know, sharp and clear, you know, very, very keen kind of assessment, right, of the need to think about race and gender in direct terms, right? So last, I want to talk about Angela Davis, and as I said, I won't say, you know, as much by way of introduction about Davis. So Angela Davis and her decades of commitment to struggle require somewhat less introduction than our other two figures. And so in the interest of time, I'm going to get right down to it. So in her book, Women, Race, and Class, Davis provides a historical account of the mutual relationships among these three phenomena presented from a Marxist perspective. She writes of racism in the early women's suffrage movement. She says, when the new century rolled around, a serious ideological marriage had linked racism and sexism in a new way. White supremacy and male supremacy, which had always had an easy courtship, openly embraced and consolidated the affair. The intellectual climate, even in progressive circles, seemed to be fatally infected with irrational notions about the superiority of the Anglo-Saxon race. If people of color were portrayed as incompetent barbarians, women, white women that is, were more rigorously depicted as mother figures, whose fundamental raison d'etre was the nurturing of the males of species. As racism developed more durable roots within white women's organizations, so too did the sexist cult of motherhood creep into the very movement whose announced aim was the elimination of male supremacy. The coupling of sexism and racism was mutually strengthening. And Davis describes how the racist ideology expressed among white women in the early feminist movement functioned as an apologia for capitalism's role in producing and maintaining racial antagonisms, right? So it helped to obfuscate and mystify the very thing that Louise Thompson Patterson was trying to explain, right? Where these racial antagonisms are presented as a kind of natural consequence of racial equality. So Davis quotes Belle Kearney, an attendee at the 1903 convention of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, as predicting the following. So Kearney predicted that if Black people acquired educational and employment opportunities, quote, the poor white man, embittered by his poverty and humiliated by his inferiority, finds no place for himself and his children. Then will come the grapple between the races, right? So again, this racial antagonism described as this kind of necessary, natural consequence, right? But Davis insists against this, that the sources of racial antagonism in capitalist society cannot be understood without an analysis of class power under capitalism. Davis writes that contrary to this logic, quote, racial conflict did not emerge spontaneously, but rather was consciously planned by the representatives of the economically ascendant class. They needed to impede working class unity so as to facilitate their own exploitative designs. And in this, Davis echoes Louise Thompson Patterson's response to a reporter's suggestion that racial antagonism would be the natural result if greater numbers of Black people were to be present in the Soviet Union, right? As we recall, Thompson's answer was that the real cause of oppression is economic exploitation, not biological aversion. Davis's discussion of the failures of the suffragist movement deftly combines analyses of how racism and class exploitation conspired to undermine the resistance to sexism, thereby reinforcing women's oppression. Davis says of Kearney's racism, quote, not an ounce of sisterly solidarity could be detected here, and there was not a word about the defeat of male supremacy or about women eventually coming into their own. It was not women's rights or women's political equality, but rather the reigning racial superiority of white people, which had to be preserved at all costs, right? So we're getting from Davis, this account of how the commitment to racism and the willingness to depict racism as a natural order, right, both provides this kind of ideological cover for capitalism's role in producing racism and simultaneously undermines the possibility of a successful movement for women's oppression. And later we see echoes of Jones, right, in Davis's analysis. She says, Black women were generally caught in a threefold bond of oppression. I have a quick question, which is how am I doing on time?
We have about a half an hour left. So if you want to.
I have a half an hour left for the event. I was like, I have half an hour left to talk? I was like, what?
Yeah.
I was
So
like,
we'd love to have
how?
some discussion.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, I asked because there's a section that is sort of easily set to the side. So I will set it to the side and move to the conclusion. Okay, so what are some lessons, right, to draw? Actually, before I do that, I will make an aside. So the quick aside is that we see Davis refer to triple oppressions, right? Race, gender, and class are often framed in that way. I think that for important reasons, so I tend to think that it's important to talk about class exploitation and race and gender oppression, and to see oppression and exploitation as two separate things. I do think that there can be class oppression, right? So this is the sort of thing that happens when a person's habits of speech are criticized because they mark them as poor, right? Or their taste in food, right, or clothing, or things of that nature. That is a kind of oppression. But when we talk about the role of class specifically, we're talking about the position that a person is in with respect to the predominant mode of production in the society. And we're talking about the extraction of value from working people, right? And then what kind of system is produced by that particular form that labor takes, right? This alienated and exploited form. And the ways that, among the things that this kind of exploitation, alienation produces, right, is a society marked by all the different kinds of forms of division and hierarchy that we see expressed in various kinds of oppression. I'm happy to sort of elaborate in Q&A, but I do want to flag that at least. So actually that segues into sort of the first of the lessons, right? And I think we have to make some distinctions between economic exploitation as occurs in the case of class domination and identity-based oppression as occurs in the case of racism and sexism, and between the subjective experience of oppression and the objective factors that conspire to produce that oppression and the experience of it. I think that it is extremely important, and we see it in each of these figures, right, that class-based does not mean class only. And oftentimes, class-based analysis is perceived as being class only, right, as being unconcerned with any other aspect of social life under capitalism, right? But that's not true. You actually have to sort of go out of your way to find the most shallow and worst sort of forms of Marxist analysis to find an analysis that is going to fit that stereotype, right? And we see in different expressions of thinkers who are thinking in ways that are class-based, but are very, very far from being class only. A second lesson that, again, I think is of really key importance. So oftentimes, I think the resistance, the hesitation about any view that would give causal or ontological priority to economic factors is the concern that something will immediately follow about what kinds of struggles we should engage in or care about, right? But establishing a causal priority for economic factors doesn't actually imply anything immediately about the order of priority in which racism, sexism, and class exploitation should be addressed. So it can be both true that capitalism is what is maintaining these three systems, and yet also true that at a given moment, it's a specifically anti-racist or anti-sexist struggle that is most pressingly urgent, right? You know, and I think we see an example of this, for example, with the Black Lives Matter protests against George Floyd, you know, where you saw sort of, you saw some sort of fringe, you know, socialist group saying like, oh, well, that's not a strike or whatever, you know, but anybody with sense, right, saw that, of course, you know, that is the struggle that deserves, you know, our attention, that needs to be furthered, you know, that we need to be thinking about how to build, how to promote it. And the fact that it is, you know, that it is most predominantly an anti-racist struggle, right, and not necessarily formulated specifically in terms of class conflict, doesn't mean that we just sort of sit by and say, oh, but we only care about the economic factors, right? That would be sort of, that would be silly and simplistic, right? So I raised the point about exploitation and oppression. Racism and sexism are not reducible to class. Nonetheless, attending to considerations of class allows us to diagnose the specific interests and power relations that make racism and sexism seem so intractable. I think it's only by engaging in class analysis that we can sort of make sense of why these are so persistent, right? Why we make so little progress in pushing back against these forms of oppression. Marxist analysis is not monolithic, right? So we cannot diagnose Marxism's capacity to theorize race and sex-based oppressions without paying much, much closer attention than folks in philosophy, at least, and I think oftentimes the academy broadly, without paying much closer attention than we often do to the vigorous dialogues and debates that occurred within Marxist movements and continue to occur. And so, and lastly, right, listen to Black women, right? We cannot sort of have an account of the tradition of Marxist thought by just, you know, by just purging from our understanding of that history any of the people that would have been most invested in struggles against identity-based oppression. So thank you so much for being here and for hearing my talk. Thank you.
And so we do have some time for questions, and I think maybe if somebody who's in the Haber Library, if there's a question in there, if you could get up in our camera so we can see you, and then if for folks who are on Zoom, if you could just put stack in the chat, then I'll know that you want to be called on. Give folks a second.
Can everyone still hear me? Because I changed my audio.
Oh no, there's a bit of an echo.
Is there still an echo?
No, that got
Okay,
it.
great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so I see Rob Metcalf. Dr. Metcalf, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Thanks, Vanessa, very much. That was fascinating talk, and I thought it was great that you profiled some of these different Black women Marxists. My question is about Marx as a philosopher, and whether there are specific places in his writings that you would direct us to where he anticipates something like intersectionality, or something like not a class only, but seeing class intersecting with other areas in some important way, just as a kind of anticipation of the debate that we're having nowadays.
Yeah, yeah. So there's a few places that come right to mind. So there's actually in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels make a statement about the struggle for women's liberation, right? And they argue that women are seen as sort of beasts of burden, essentially, right? That they're treated as for their sort of productive capacity, and that when we think about the ways that women are oppressed in virtue of their role as mothers, right, their reproductive labor, right, that this is a kind of way of oppressing them as laborers of a certain kind, but it's not reducible at the same time to the kind of thing that happens in wage labor. And they argue that women's oppressed status is something that we won't be able to do away with without doing away with the sort of instrumentalist way that we approach human beings generally, right? And so they talk about the sort of specially oppressed nature or status of women as this heightened example of the way that capitalism sort of treats us all in this instrumentalized way. Marx also writes, I'm blanking on the exact spot, but he has this he writes that the status of women is a kind of litmus test of alienation in a society, right? So the argument is that the relationship between, so he's talking specifically about sort of heterosexual gendered relations, and he says that the relations between men and women are a sign of the level of progress in the society as a whole. Why? Because women are people, right? So understanding how men and women are relating is a way of understanding how human beings are relating to human beings, right? And whether that is an alienated or an unalienated relationship. Marx also, so he wrote an open letter to Abraham Lincoln. He wrote letters addressed to white workers in the United States about slavery, right? And argued that that labor in the white skin could not be free so long as labor in the black is branded, right? And so there's like many places where he himself explicitly drew these connections, right? And saw these as incredibly interconnected struggles. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah.
I put myself in the stack, but is there anybody in the library with a question? I know we have a lot of students in there. I want to make sure we're not. You're all okay? Okay. All right, I get to be next. Thanks so much for this talk. This is such an exciting project, and I'm so looking forward to, I'm so glad you have next semester to work on it. That's so great.
Yeah, I'm really excited about it. Yeah.
That's great. I guess one question is just a kind of like, who else is in the book? And is Kianga Yamada Taylor somebody you're gonna talk about in the book? And then the second question is sort of related, and just I was noticing, especially when you were talking about Claudia Jones, the importance of prisons as a site of, and the sort of criminalization, the processes of criminalization as a site of work. And that Angela Davis, obviously, this has been hugely important in her work. And so I was just wondering if that theme of abolitionism was going to be important to the project, or how you were kind of working out this relationship between class exploitation and then racism and sexism.
Yeah. So figures like Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Shirley Graham Du Bois, Williana Burroughs. The funny thing is, like, I hadn't, but, I'm like, yeah, Kianga should be in the book, like, so thank you. This is the beauty of Q&A, right? So yeah, I really want it to be, a fairly broad swath, obviously, right? And to be able to show both the sort of diversity of thought, right, among these figures, but also there are certain things that do kind of come up, again and again as things that they're all trying to tell us, right? And so to be able to sort of be doing both things, right? Yeah. And I'm not sure I totally. I want to make sure that I'm addressing the core of the second question. So are you asking what is the sort of particular role of the prison industrial complex in relationship to these questions of exploitation and oppression?
Yeah, I guess I wonder if that theme is going to be important to how you're sort of weaving the story of the book, because it was just striking to me how Claudia Jones, right, it's the Scottsboro Boys and the CPA's mobilization around that, anti-lynching, and you said,
Yep.
Wilson,
Yep.
right, like.
When we get to Gilmore, we're talking about, abolishing prisons, abolishing police. Same with Davis. Yeah, I mean, they can't, between being Black and being communist, that you just can't, you can't avoid the question of jail and imprisonment, and yeah, so I do expect that to be a consistent theme, and something where where we encounter authors who are thinking about these questions about carcerality, like with this case of both carcerality and sort of like extrajudicial forms of law keeping, right, in the form of lynching and so on, and that absolutely is something that I expect to emerge as a central theme for. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, it's just so striking. So thank you. Yeah.
It is. Yeah, and and Davis, I'm sorry, Jones in particular, because she it's just I mean, something that emerges really quickly is you just see the physical toll that it takes on a person to, first of all, just to exist as a Black woman, and then to have the gall, right, to exist as a Black woman who resists her situation. And with Jones, we just see the incredible stress and trauma that she was placed under, and then she dies very, very young, and again, there's poems that she exchanged with a friend while she was in prison, and where she's sort of talking about her experiences, and then also the sort of connection that she found there. She had this like incredibly deep friendship. So yeah, I mean, a lot of these stories and a lot of their theorizing is very intrinsically connected to carcerality, both as a kind of theoretical object and as an object of political resistance, but also just in the process of trying to make sense of their own lives as they're living it, because they're in and out of jail. Davis, same thing, right? Yeah.
That's great, thank you. I think it's Candace, and then Baram, and then Jeff.
Can you hear me with this on?
I can.
Okay. Well, thank you, Vanessa. I think this was a terrific talk.
Thank you.
I wanted I was going to return to something Rob asked. And I mean, just because of refresher on Marx, does Marx make a distinction between oppression and exploitation? Or, I mean, I think that's a fantastic distinction. It's very important. But I don't know if he does that, or is that other communist authors, that from you, or where does that come in?
Yeah, so I don't think there's a place in Marx where he draws that line explicitly. But the thing that he describes as exploitation is definitely conceptually distinct from the thing that people are generally describing when they talk about oppression. And I think one of the places where Marxist analyses and other kinds of sometimes rival theories, I don't think they have to be rivals, but often they are positioned against one another as rivals. So whether it's various kinds of feminist approaches, intersectional approaches, critical race theory approaches, right? Oftentimes the point of debate is about which one of these forms of oppression is central, race, class, or gender. And if we look at them all as forms of oppression, right, and I think of oppression, I tend to define oppression as ways in which people are deprived of their full membership in society, right? Ways in which they're deprived of their capacity to exist as full citizens, right? Or as full human beings. Whereas exploitation is like this very specific economic relation. You can be oppressed, and Barack Obama is oppressed, right? He's not exploited. He's the head capitalist, right? So he's not exploited, right? But he does experience race-based oppression, right? So if we think of each of these as just being forms of oppression, then it starts to look extremely arbitrary why we should think that any one of them is sort of more central, right, in driving the interactions among them, right? And I think this is one of the sort of key critiques that intersectional theorists will often make, right, of Marxism, right? I think that critique has more immediate plausibility if we are, as intersectional theorists often are, looking at this from the sort of subjective experience of an oppressed person, right? So for me as a Black woman worker, right, a privileged worker, but a worker, the thing, being a worker, as whatever, faculty at a university is like, it has its frustrations, but it's not, I'm not digging ditches or anything, right? So the thing that as a felt subjective experience speaking for me, it's being Black, right? That's being a woman is sort of not that bad, it's annoying, there's sexism and stuff, but it's being Black that in terms of my subjective everyday experience, I experience is like, like the racism is just unbelievable, right? So if we look at the content of my subjective experience, then it's not going to be obvious at all why we should pick class as being sort of specially important. And something else is going to emerge, right? Maybe race, right? This is the lesson of critical race theory. This is the kind of argument that Charles Mills used to make, right? He sort of made different arguments closer to the end of his life, but he argued that race was the thing that people tended to subjectively identify with the most, and therefore it's the central antagonism, right, in social life, and the central determining category in social life. Okay, but if we step back and ask a question that Marxists like to ask, which is, but what is going on objectively that produces a subjective experience of a certain kind, right? How do I explain how it is that we have a world that makes race so salient for me? And the thing that usually sort of distinguishes, you know, I'm just gonna sort of like controversially just say good and correct Marxist approaches. We can argue about that later. But the thing that, like, you know, the thing that separates those kinds of approaches from a number of kinds of approaches we see in intersectionality or critical race theory is this willingness to go there and say, I can give an objective account, right, of what is producing these subjective experiences. And that's what Marxists think they can get with a theory of class exploitation, right? And the argument is that because all of our social life and all of our perspectives on the world and our experience of the world is all a human product, right? The question then is, how do we produce ourselves? How do we reproduce the things that we need? How do we produce the world that we're in? And it turns out that we organize that production in a capitalist society according to capitalist capitalist mode of production. And that is one where most of the people who produce the world that we live in have very little say over it, right? And one that puts a lot of that very heavily incentivizes those who do have control, right, to promote or at least not rock the boat on anything that's going to divide the working class, that's going to prevent working people from seeing that they have this interest. So that's all like very, very quick, you know, kind of nutshell version. But that's why, you know, in my view, it's really important to think of exploitation as not just being a form of oppression like the others. It is something else. It is a material relation that produces, right, these social phenomenon.
Right. I get. Oh, thank you very much. Actually, that was extremely helpful.
Oh, good. Yeah.
So Bahram, you're up next.
Yeah, thank you so much. I have a short comment and then a question. So the first one is that a comment is that when I was reading the quotes that you pull from Jones and Thompson Patterson, I was thinking that they are, while they are characterizing Black women as triply oppressed, but at the same time, I really love that they portray them as like center of the Black community. So they're actually appealing as a strategy that you should reach out to Black women to bring in all the Black population, right, to the Communist Party. So that I really that really spoke to me a lot, because they're
especially
the centrality.
Patterson,
right. So yeah, that's just a comment, observation. And then my question is that when going back to your initial comment about Trump getting elected and how people are puzzled by it, I was thinking that like I grew up I guess in high school and stuff, like Marxism was still a grand narrative. So like everyone had to read Marx, and now it's not the case, right? Like so much. But then when Trump got elected, I was teaching courses on race, but then I was thinking that, wow, like we really need to go back to Marx and we educate people on class consciousness, right? Because there's a thick population where like they vote against their interests, right? Because of the lack of class consciousness, right? The white working class in the rural area, right? So so I was like sort of sensing this like resurgence of Marxism in that way, or at least in my pedagogy, I was thinking like I should do more economic theory in philosophy classes. And so my question is that, so there's a way in which the lack of class consciousness, political consciousness, or false consciousness of people drives people more toward the white supremacy, right? This rise of white supremacy, right? Like, because they're not in line with like where they are in terms of class. So they stick with their white identity, and like that ends up electing someone who would actually harm them most, right?
Mhm.
So if you so in that regard, I can really see how valuable this project can be. So I was wondering, not only just doing class analysis better by bringing in race and gender, but also this Black women Marxist work can help us understand white supremacy better, and like how to how to do better in the racial struggle as well. So in the other way around, right? So so I was wondering what you would draw out of these thinkers, right? Like in terms of contemporary application or implications.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one place where, you know, some of the things that I drew out about, especially Davis and Jones, about their critiques of the sort of feminist movements of the time, right, and arguing, look, like these projects are doomed to failure unless you deal with your racism, right? Unless you deal with your commitment to white supremacy. And it's interesting, like, I think like the Trump phenomenon is also this kind of special case where, when we look at, for example, at the folks who were organizing the anti-vax protests and the lockdown protests and all this sort of stuff, they were disproportionately not workers at all, right? And actually were disproportionately small business owners. The folks that came to I'm in DC, so the folks who came here on January 6th were also disproportionately small business owners. And it's interesting because, there's a kind of separate analysis of the class consciousness of small business owners, and I think that in some ways it's less clear that they are actually voting against their interests, like in a sort of like larger human sense, sure, right? But I think oftentimes, a lot of those folks that are the most supportive of politics like what Trump represents, they're not deluded at all, right? Like a lot of them, I think especially if we look at sort of early stages of the pandemic, when you saw workers saying, well, we want rent relief and we want better unemployment benefits, some of which people got. There was a huge interest in universal health care, right? In and not just sort of putting a moratorium on rent where people have to pay it at some point in the future, but actually canceling it and using funds to pay it, right? I mean, the things that that folks got in a number of European countries, that would have been great to have in the United States, but and then against that, we have these anti-mask, anti-lockdown protests, and in my view, the sort of connective tissue of those protests was a resistance to any kind of social response to the crisis, right? And I think this is a lot of what animates anti-vax sentiment as well, right? Just a complete rejection of any response to crisis that involves people working together, right? An insistence that it would just be sort of everyone on their own, which is the sort of thing that you might want if you run a little small business somewhere and you don't really want to pay people a whole lot, And small business owners tend to move in one direction or the other. So there's lots of small business owners who, have solidarity with the working class because maybe they just came out of it, or they're still working, right, or all this stuff. But it's this kind of unstable sort of contradictory kind of class consciousness that goes along with that particular class position. And we saw it, especially with January 6th, where just this like bizarre, like very overrepresented, you know, among those folks. And people say, well, it's because you need money to come to DC, but that's because they don't live in DC. People come and protest here all the time, right, from all sort of walks of life and so on. So yeah, so I think in terms of thinking about white supremacy, there's both the question of being able to make arguments to people in whom it really isn't in their interest to promote white supremacy, and then also to have a correct analysis of in whose interest white supremacy really is, right? And therefore of like, you know, of what kinds of political interventions, you know, we need to have in order to oppose that. It's the same kind of social base as the Klan, right? The Klan was like judges, sheriffs, you know, small business owners, right? That thought that, you know, who had an economic position from which they actually really benefited from white supremacy.
So we're a little bit over time, and I just want to say thank you again.
Thank you
so
for
much
having
the
me,
talk, Dr. Wells. Yeah, and I would love to, yeah, do another round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A little heart react. Thank you.
Heart back at you. Yeah, and I so hope that we can do another talk in the future that is safely in person, and
it'd be great.
Our library is really lovely, and we have wonderful snacks in normal times. And
I like snacks. Yeah, that would be lovely. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. And yeah, as I predicted, the technical problems were all at the beginning, and none, you know, to continue. So I'm glad we were able to have a really great conversation, and I found it very, very helpful. And thank you very much for engaging with me on my project.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for coming.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Celestri.
Yeah, thank you so much.
It was great to have folks in the library be able to
I was a little afraid that was not going to work very well, but it turned out to be very well.
It worked great, yeah, and thank you so much for helping to organize that.
No problem. I hope that we get her W-9 and everything, so we can.
I'll bother her. Yeah, I'll keep on her to make sure that happens. So
yeah, and also we need her phone number as well, because when I'm filling out the form on CU Marketplace for the honorarium process, they need the individual's phone number, which I found out for Emily's this morning, so that's why I sent it correct.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
On it, so hopefully we're good.
Okay. Yeah.
All right, we're gonna disconnect here.
Great. And Brahm, thank you for that great introduction. I really appreciate you taking that role.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing the speaker. Should we stop recording now?
Yeah, thanks, Jacob.
Yeah,
Oh, yes. Oh, right. Thank you. I totally forgot.